All right, so now what I want to do is take this and introduce some value. So just remember, value is really just shades of gray, everything from dark to white, and everything in between. And it's just really a nice way to describe forms. Throughout this course, I want to show you ways to describe things with lines and value as well. So value is going to typically give you realism. It takes lots of practice to get a sense of realism, but I recommend at whatever level you're at, you just start doing it. And keep in mind that you can do this with just a regular pencil and a rolled up piece of paper as a blending stump. That's actually how I started. I moved into charcoal for a while, but now I just use a smudge brush. But if you notice, I introduced some lines and then I just smudge them around. Now another way is just to take a soft brush and turn the opacity down and use it really lightly and slowly build up, and then scaling the brush up and down to get more defined edges. If you need help with that, I'd be happy to make another lesson that's more specific on that. But here, I don't want the education to be about that as much as I just want you to see the difference in what the art looks like as we start to introduce value. It's just a different way to explain the forms. Again, I like to do most of it with line art, but I think it's important to show you a variety of ways to accomplish these techniques and really the effect that it has as you develop the forms. So one thing that I find helpful to do is not really look at this like, at some instances as I'm doing this, is not to look at each of these areas like the anatomy that I'm trying to describe. So for the most part, I'm trying to be aware of the shapes and forms that mean a shoulder blade or a scapula or a deltoid or a trapezius. But then at certain points, I find it helpful to block that part out and simply focus on the gradation, the value, and the light source. If not, it's very easy to over describe a certain shape that you might be used to drawing and then not describing the neighboring form. Okay, so again, I think it's helpful to do both. There's parts where you definitely want to focus and zero in on the very thing that you're studying very specifically, but then as I think I've mentioned before, not to be so rigid in that way of thinking so that you don't over describe the form. You don't make the description of it too harsh with the shadows, too overly drawn out with the lines. It's a idea that these forms are blending in and out of the larger masses. Very important, and that's the area where you're going to need to soften things up. So sometimes you can have something described really well, and you just need to pull it back a bit. You need to blend something. You need to use a softer edge where you have a hard edge. Simple things like that. But one thing I will tell you about this way of doing things is, well, like anything, you have to be very patient. It doesn't come to you immediately, or at least it didn't for me. And I still find areas like this to be difficult. I would say that more than likely for me, it's because I spend more time describing things with lines. But it's not like I don't ever paint. I paint, a good amount. I went on areas of my work where I did a lot of painting. So I'm very used to blending it and trying to describe forms with it. But I think that naturally I'm more comfortable with line work. So again, all this really is a smudge brush. You can find it in any software, and you just want to play around with the intensity of the smudge. What I like to do as well is increase the size of the brush and make it bigger than the area I'm trying to smudge. So what I mean by that, if you can see that the size of the brush, that little circle that's moving on the screen, it's larger than the area that I'm actually thinking about smudging. So if I want a better blend, I'll increase that brush size considerably, but I have to be careful because I can destroy some of the harder edge shadows that I'm trying to convey. So again, it's just a very subtle approach, or a subtle blend that I want, and that's why you'll see a lot of artists that do this. They go right to a soft brush and less with the smudging. So the reason I kind of like this too is when I'm introducing these lines, it feels like I'm working just like I would on paper. So that's exactly the way I would use charcoal. I would throw in some little sketch lines. Generally, those lines are going to go right with the direction of the form. I think that's helpful to do anyways, because when you go to do, you'll see as we do more examples in our line art versions, that you want the lines to go with the direction of the forms. And I'll be honest, that's something that I didn't do a lot of. Recently learned that from different artists that I've studied. And it's something that I need to approach more. I need to apply more in my own work. But luckily I can share that with you today. And I say, you know, when you're doing these lines, make those wrapping lines or those shadows and forms, that cross hatching even, make the primary look of those lines go with the shape of the form that you're trying to describe. So here, introducing some soft brush just because it helps me fill in the rest of the major forms of the body, so the entire torso, and I'll do that with the arm and everything else. I find that to be a better way to blend the white to a deeper value. So when I'm generally doing this, I will work off a colored background, and you pretty much never want white in there. You want white to be very sparingly used. It's very powerful for one, and it's not as evident in real life as we would suspect. A good way to really pay attention to this is to take any photo that you admire, just any photo really, and convert it to a grayscale in a software like Photoshop or Procreate or Clip Studio. They all have abilities to convert to a grayscale. And not without adjusting, and don't adjust the values. What I mean is simply convert it to a real grayscale. And what's neat about that is you'll see, you'll get a better idea and representation of the values of skin in a table and an ashtray or a wall behind something else. You'll start to see that white is very rare around us. Generally, the only time you do see it is in something that's been constructed and fabricated, or a sheet of paper or something like that. And even still, it's very rarely bright white. So once you start to pay more attention to that, you realize that when you're creating your value studies, to use very, very little white, and to use it just for those tiny little highlights and those extreme peaks of the form, something that's glossy or there's a strong glare, strong light source. And then what it does is it uses that, or that starts to be a lot better representation of a powerful device. Like it directs the eye really well, and it really kind of finishes off the work. So you start to really utilize that sparingly and more effectively. But I think in the beginning, when we try to do stuff like this, we're very, we go for what looks cool, and then all of a sudden we see that white is very powerful, and then we overuse it, and then it comes across as more amateurish. I haven't mastered that myself yet. It's something that takes lots of time, lots of studies, but first you have to be aware of it, and then you have to make sure that you develop that particular part of your skill set as you create your studies. So another thing is I've also made sure to shadow the form a little bit darker from the bottom. So another way to convey scale to almost anything, but definitely things that are larger, you really utilize this technique, is you always shadow the bottom just a little bit more. And if it's something dramatically large, it's usually a little more apparent. But in this case, just a little bit more of a shadow on the base of anything. And then, obviously the side away from the greater light source. Skin is very reflective, so that's another reason I wanted to introduce some of these studies into this course, is because it's very apparent when you do value studies that you can see that reflectivity in that dual light source. And that's usually pretty apparent in almost anything. It's very rare that we have just one strong specific light source. And again, skin is actually pretty reflective, and you see that more, I think, in value studies. So I thought it would be important to showcase this. So also introducing little bits of lines as I go here, just trying to kind of point out certain areas. I think there's a little bit too much space in between the way the trapezius is on the back of the skull there to the sternocleidomastoid that mounts just below the ear, behind the ear. So that's something that to be aware of. There is some definite space in between those, but I think there's a little bit too much distance there. Now, and I want you to know that that's something that I think we all have to do. We have to analyze our work as we get through it. None of these works of art are perfect, but the idea is that we get closer and closer, and you got to stay excited about that process. You have to look at it and say, I know it could be better. I know that I'm maybe missing something here, but you have to look for the areas within your work that are less than perfect and become excited about figuring that area out, being intrigued about the pursuit. Now, I also think it's important to look at areas and say, wow, I really like the way that came out. So for me, I wasn't liking the way I was explaining the forms and the volume on the back, the trapezius to the spine of scapula, and the separation of the back there as it starts to approach the lower lumbar, which we can't really see from this angle. But so that area with the trapezius and the scapula, I wasn't really enjoying at first. I was thinking that it just wasn't coming out as good as I had hoped. I kept going, I kept pushing forward. And now it's actually, in this illustration, it's one of my favorite parts of this illustration. So again, it's, allowing yourself to have those wins and acknowledging the losses, acknowledging the things that could be better, and then going into it with a productive, happy state of mind, not getting, not beating yourself up too much where you're like, oh, I just can't draw that, I'll avoid it, I'll get to that later. You don't want to do that. Instead, acknowledge it, make notes of it, and come back stronger and really go for that area. I think that's super important, that you're going to get a lot more mileage out of your studies by going against the grain, against the things that you don't understand. But again, also making time to appreciate the things that come out right. That's a great thing as well, because that does boost your confidence. It lets you know that you are making some improvements, which is highly important. But the main thing is the actual amount of time that you put into these studies. So I think that a good thing to think about is when you're a novice, when you're a beginner, is to spend half of your time studying and half of your time creating the next amazing work of art that you want to see finished. And so you might think of that and say, well, if I'm drawing the next work of art, aren't I studying then? I think there's a very different mindset from studying and considering it in a study and looking for things that you need to study versus that next work of art. So again, I think that in the beginning it's more of a 50-50, and then as you become a professional and you segue to more and more time of completed works, I think you still need to make time. I don't think you would ever go to a point in your career, me personally anyways, where I would take it below 20% of my time creating studies to improve my skill set. So hopefully you've enjoyed this video. We'll continue on and do more studies and talk about more areas of the body. So with that, let's move forward.